Hi, folks. I guess I'll go first. It's really nice to see all of your messages coming from different places. Thanks for joining us today. It's a lovely sunny evening here in Berlin. I hope it's nice too, wherever you are. I won't bore you for long. I'll briefly introduce myself and then I'll hand over to our speaker for today. So my name is Rufus. I'm a lead dev here at Thoughtworks. You may have seen me before. I've done a couple of these meetup talks before in the past. And I'll just be helping out as MC and moderator for some of the questions in the discussion section later on. Speaking of being excellent to one another, it is my great pleasure to introduce a truly excellent person in Karina. So Karina joined Thoughtworks earlier this year. I was actually the tech lead on her first ever project at Thoughtworks, which was a great pleasure. I discovered early on in our collaboration that she had done some very interesting investigation into mobile frameworks as part of her university studies. And so I encouraged her to share and present those findings with the wider community. So I'm super proud to have her here today and that she sort of took on that challenge and is now sharing her knowledge and experience with all of you. So please do join me in giving her a very warm welcome, and stage is yours, Karina.
Thank you, Rufus. Thank you very much for the introduction. So let me share my screen. All right, I hope everyone can see the screen. All right, so that sounds like a yes, no complaints. So yeah, thank you very much, Rufus. Yeah, as Rufus mentioned, I'm a software developer at Thoughtworks. And today, as you can guess from the title, I want to talk a little bit about React Native and Flutter as cross-platform frameworks. So first of all, I would like to give a little introduction and why actually cross-platform development is a thing on mobile applications, and also to have a closer look like what different approaches are there of developing mobile applications. Of course, then have a closer look at React Native and Flutter and which common criteria are there to choose the right framework for your application. So as you might have realized yourself, I definitely did mobile application apps, and of course the smartphone is a really essential part of our lives. So there's an app for every case, if it comes to ordering food, if it comes to doing banking things or just doing shopping online, there's an app for it. And this really high demand on apps can be also seen in the mobile app downloads worldwide, which increased in the last years a lot. So in 2016, there were around 140 billion downloads from the App Store, the Google Play Store, and also counted other smaller independent app stores. And in 2020, it was already 218 billion downloads. So over the last 4 years, this number actually increased a lot, and there's a high demand in app development. So why is cross-platform development a thing when it comes to mobile applications and also in developing mobile applications? So if you want to have make your app available for a broad audience on a highly frequented market, which also includes different platforms, different devices, and you want to do this natively, which would mean that you would have to develop the application in the native language of the platform. This can get really resource intensive and also really cost intensive. And I think a quote from Martin Fowler, who's also from Thoughtworks, sums this up really well. It's already from 2012. So a recent client told us that they looked at the cost to create a BlackBerry version of their mobile app. They figured out that it would be cheaper to buy all the BlackBerry users an iPhone instead. And I think this sums it up really well. Although we don't have BlackBerries in 2021 anymore, really, but Android and iOS are still because the market got a bit smaller, so Android and iOS are the most important platforms nowadays because the two of them almost make up 100% of the market. But still, it can still get really resource intensive because you would then have two separate teams to develop a mobile application. And of course, you do everything twice. So this is actually where cross-platform development comes into play. And what they promise is that you only have to develop your code once, and then you can run it on different platforms. And this is why we have a look at React Native and Flutter, because those two frameworks are actually in the last years the most popular ones when it comes to cross-platform frameworks. So both of them are actually under the top 30 repositories on GitHub. React Native has almost 89,000 stars, and Flutter, for example, 130,000 stars. But they're not only popular on GitHub. Also, you might have heard of the Stack Overflow service, for example, where Stack Overflow is asking developers about like frameworks, libraries, and also about like programming languages they like, they don't like. And when it comes to also asking like developers who have already worked with the framework, if they like to continue working with it, then for React Native, 58% agreed that they would like to continue working with the framework, and for Flutter, almost 69%. So this shows that they're not only popular, but they also like, but also developers, or the majority of developers who have worked with them, would like to continue working with them. So this makes it actually really interesting to have a closer look at the two of them. But before we do this, let's have actually a look at how, or like which different approaches are out there to develop a mobile application, which do not need, which do not require knowledge of the native language of the platform. And there are actually different approaches out there. So if we have a look at this slide, let's start on the very left side, which is kind of a bit more general. So let's start with mobile web apps, which are actually, you can also think of them as a website, of a web page, which is optimized for mobile and would be accessible over the browser of the mobile phone. This, of course, means that you have limited functionality, and also the look and feel might differ, because you might not be able to use native elements of the platform as you can use in an app. Another approach would be, for example, the hybrid development, when you have like still those web components, so-called web views, which are integrated in a native container. And this approach tries to close the gap between web technologies and the hardware of the mobile phone. Like famous or well-known frameworks who follow this approach are Ionic and Cordova, which you might have heard before. Another approach is the independent runtime environment. So this would mean that the framework in this case would bring its own engine to render elements. So it is like completely free then to display the user interface from the browser engine, and gives like with this, because it provides its own engine, gives like a lot more flexibility in, for example, how you can create user interfaces. So in that case, it's also possible to use native elements of the platform. Another approach would be one of those, what would be a generative approach. So that actually means that the code is written in a platform independent language, but it gets compiled to native code. Which then, of course, has also a lot of advantages. But of course, then also like on the right side, we come to native development. So that would mean that you develop your application like in the native language of the platform, which would be, of course, like for Android, it would be Java or Kotlin, and for iOS, it would be Swift, or like in older days, Objective-C. And if you wonder now where on those slides you would put React Native or Flutter, you would put React Native or Flutter. Then we would see React Native on the independent runtime environment, which is because it brings its own engine with it. And Flutter is following the generative approach, and to be more precise, a cross-compiling one. So let's actually have a closer look at the two frameworks then. React Native got released in 2015 by Facebook, and It's an open source project and it's available under the MIT license. And it has a flat learning core for web developers because it's using really familiar technologies, for example, like JavaScript or TypeScript as programming language. Flutter got released in 2017 by Google, and the first stable version came out in 2018. It's also an open source project and it's available under the BSD free clause license. It's using Dart as a programming language, which got also released by Google in 2011. And it is not as well known as TypeScript or JavaScript, but it also has a lot of similarity with other well-known programming languages. It also supports web development because it can transpile to JavaScript, which also gives Flutter the possibility to not only offer cross-platform development for mobile applications, but also, for example, for the web. So if we now have a look how React Native actually, like how the technical approach behind React Native is, and actually also, or like one concept which got introduced by Facebook through its web framework React is actually the virtual DOM, which made also the development of React Native possible. Maybe some of you already have heard of it or know it. So the virtual DOM is it's like a cached version of the actual DOM. And then in the virtual DOM, you have the advantage that you can already calculate which elements will have to re-render. And then in the actual DOM, only those affected elements would have or would need to be re-rendered. Would then, of course, be re-rendered. So in the case of React Native, you could actually then, instead of calling like the real DOM, it's possible to call the APIs of the native platform, which would be affected and which would then re-render the affected elements. So this means that React Native is using like the native elements of the platform to display the user interface. So for example, if you see an iOS application, if you build a React Native application and you run it on an iOS device, this is like you really have, for example, if you have a button, it will be really a UI button used. So that means that React Native, like to be able to interact with the native elements of the platform, it needs to communicate also with, it needs to be able to communicate with them. And for this, there is this so-called bridge. So the so-called bridge enables actually that React Native can call asynchronously or communicate asynchronously with the native threads of the platform. So if you have a look at this slide, like each interaction would start on the right side, on the platform side. For example, a user taps on a button, and then this gets communicated asynchronously over the bridge to the application code. There might be something happening. Maybe this would lead to some re-renderings of some elements in the view, and then this response would be sent back to the platform side. Also, React Native is interpreted at runtime because it's interpreted at runtime. So let's have a look at Flutter, because Flutter does follow a different approach here. Flutter is actually not using like the native elements to display the user interface. It's completely independent from the render stack of the platform because it has also its own graphic engine, which is called Skier. And you might have heard of it because it's also used for the Chrome browser. The cool thing about Flutter is that it really only needs a blank canvas from the platform. And then the widgets and the rendering, all of this is happening inside of the app. So Flutter actually compiles to bytecode ahead of time in production. Whereas in development, Flutter is also interpreted just in time and runtime, which enables feature like in a Dart VM, which enables features like, for example, the hot reload or the hot restart. you can see instantly changes. This would actually be a really short, really simple example of a React Native application. But you can see that like a React Native application consists out of different components, and each component has a render method. And this render method, its job is it basically to describe the like how a view or like how a component is like described through different smaller components. So this XML kind of style of Markdown style here, it's like, it's called JSX, and you maybe know it already from React. Also, the styling is quite similar to CSS. You can use it like either inline and of course in more complex applications in a different file. Flutter is quite, Flutter also follows close principles like this, but in Flutter, everything is a widget. So that means a widget has, as you can see here in this example, also a build method, which will then describe how this widget is built through smaller widgets. Also, you can see here, for example, that widget does not only need to be a user interface element, it can also be layout information or even like a function, for example, like a swipe gesture. As you can see here on the body parameter, we have the center widget. So that would, for example, mean that everything which follows the center widget will be also displayed centrally on the screen. And it needs a bit of time to get your head around it, but it's actually a really nice concept. So this actually, like through this, this creates like a so-called widget tree in Flutter, which can get actually quite complicated and which also needs like a lot of discipline from the developers. But it also, it's a really nice way to describe, to decorate the user interface. But this was like an overview of the framework. Let's have a look at like other criteria when it comes to choosing one of them. And definitely when it comes to mobile applications, one is the user interface. So when it comes to React Native applications, the core library from React actually does not provide too many components in its core library. So that means there are either third-party libraries you can use to create like more advanced user interfaces, or of course you can write them yourself. Whereas Flutter comes already with a lot of widgets in its core library, so there's already a lot of support there out of the box. Also, Flutter has, like, as you could have seen in the example before, there's this material app, which imitates, for example, the more like Android looks and feel. There's also the alternative for iOS application, which is called Cupertino, which would then imitate the iOS behavior. So there's already a lot of out of the box which comes with Flutter. Another thing is, like, this is kind of like the big difference between React Native and Flutter, that React Native is using the native elements of the platform. So that would mean if you have an application, it is really likely that it will look close to a native application that you would have developed, as well as like the behavior and the animations. On the other side, Flutter uses its own elements. So that means you're like really free in creating the user interface, and you're really independent from the native platform. So that also means that with Flutter, you can really make sure if maybe like the native look and feel is not that important to you, and you really want to make sure that your application looks really the same, independent from the platform, then Flutter can offer you this, because it just needs a blank canvas, and you can really make sure that your appearance of the app, despite of the platform, is consistent. This also goes for different operating system versions. So it might be that in different operating system, like an older version, that a button or maybe something else would look different than it would look on newer ones. And because Flutter does not like need anything from the native platform in that case, you can make also on this, like for this aspect, you can also make sure that it will be rendered the same way. And also another aspect is you can, of course, also integrate native parts in your Flutter or in your React Native application. So you can have parts of the code which will be native. And then those ones, of course, when you have a Flutter application, they'll use the native elements to display the user interface. So that would mean, especially on Flutter application, it's really important to make sure if you have this use case that you make sure your app in itself will look consistent, because of course the Flutter part would then use use its own render stack to display the elements. Whereas like the native part, of course, would use a native element. So it's really important, or like might be good to make sure in that case that it will really look the same throughout the whole app. Another important point is, of course, always the performance, because no one likes to wait, especially not when you grab your phone and you have only a few minutes, you want to look something up. So both frameworks do promise 60 frames per second, which is definitely sufficient. And it's always really hard to like point out which framework is faster, because it always depends on the use case, and it's always really hard to say what are like the what is giving, like if it was always like under the same circumstances. But Flutter has a really promising approach, it's really promising the technical approach behind it, because it is compiled ahead of time into bytecode, which means it doesn't need during runtime this asynchronous communication with the native threads as React Native does. So this gives Flutter here actually some really good possibilities, I would say, but also it always depends like on the use case you're having. Another really important point is, of course, also like the developer experience. How fast can you get started with developing React Native or Flutter applications, and how easy is it? Or and one point which I like to highlight, which I like to highlight, is that both React Native and Flutter support features like hot reload or hot restart, which means that you can still have your app running and you can make changes to the user interface, and then you can see those changes instantly. So this is actually a really cool feature, and like maybe like for web developers, this might not sound really new, but if you think of you developing native applications, and you have to actually recompile your code, which could take a few minutes, this is actually a really nice feature. Another one, of course, is like testing and deployment. So for Flutter application, there's actually a lot of support out there by Google. So there's a big documentation, and it's also like for different use cases, or so when it comes to also like different levels of testing. So when it comes to widget testing, unit testing, and also integration testing, there's a lot of support there by Google. Also, maybe some of you might have Mockito, maybe more from the Java context, and this is also available for Flutter tests. So you have actually really good support there. Also, like how you can get, for example, with Fastlane, your app deployed. This is also all like this documentation is all provided by Google. Whereas on React, there's not so much official documentation out there for React Native, but of course there are tools, for example, like Jest, to help with React, like also for unit testing and also for snapshot testing, and also tools like the React Native testing library. And also, of course, you can also deploy your React Native app with Fastlane. And there's also, of course, a lot of community support out there, but like the official docs are not as extensive. And of course, there are other tools like Expo who might also be really helpful when it comes to that. Another big point is the community. And as I just mentioned, there's like with React Native, there is a really huge community, and you have definitely a big advantage when you're using React Native apps in that aspect, because it's not only the community around React Native, it's also the community like and the whole ecosystem around JavaScript. So that means if you maybe look for a specific library or there's like some problem you encounter, you have like the whole JavaScript world who might be able to help you. And this is really huge. And this is like a big advantage. And there's also great support for IDEs and text editors, like for example, like Visual Studio Code. Whereas the Flutter, the community, like with Flutter and using Dart as a programming language, it's a bit more specific. So there are, of course, also support for IDEs and editors. For example, there's a really good plugin for Android Studio, which is also based on IntelliJ. But one thing which is also really nice at Flutter is PubDev, which is like the official package manager of Flutter. And this is actually really well supported also by Google. So Google is actually rating the packages there regularly and giving like a hint or like giving an idea how many, how well maintained the package is, or like just in general how good it is. In some aspects, there are like also different aspects where like the packages are rated. So it's actually a big advantage if you just get started with Flutter and you want to get an idea what might be helpful to you. So it really helps you there. Another important point, of course, is also the long-term support. So of course, no one likes to develop a framework and then like develop an application with a specific framework and when it's maybe not supported a year afterwards. So as I just mentioned, like Google really tries to work together with the Flutter community. And I would say like both frameworks are really much alive, as you can say, and they still like evolving. So I think you can see that really well, for example, that Google is now saying that you should use like for a simple state management approach that you should use the provider package, which was originally developed by the community around Flutter, and then Google jumped in because of the really good feedback it got and helped to develop this and make this bigger and like really to help the community there and to work together with them. So that I think is really shown that they put a lot of effort in involving this framework, and also to do this closely together with the community and what the people need. But this also means that maybe sometimes things could still change if you develop with this framework. So that is actually, I think, actually one important point. But this also goes like for React Native, of course. It's a stable framework. There, of course, is a lot of like the community out there. There are a lot of apps developed also with React Native. So of course, you also have a really good support there. And also, if you think about developing your application with one of those frameworks, might also be an idea that you might be able to contribute to the open source project as well. So that might also be always something to keep in mind. And now, which framework should you use? Should you choose? Should it be React Native or Flutter? And as you might have guessed, probably from the title, the answer is, of course, as it is from consultants, it depends. And but I think it's always good to know, like, why does it depend? And just to sum up some points I've just mentioned is actually for React Native. So it uses the native elements of the platform to display the user interface. It's interpreted just in time, and it has a larger community and a really big environment and ecosystem around it. And also has a flat learning curve for web developers. So if you have a team of web developers, then React Native might be your choice. When Flutter, Flutter also has like a really extensive developer support. So there's a lot of tutorials, a lot of documentation out there to get you started. It's compiled ahead of time. The technical approach offers actually better performance possibilities. And it also has a highly customizable user interface because it doesn't depend on native elements of the platform at all. And I think but I think one of the most important points is when it comes to like choosing your framework for mobile applications is actually what is the main, to think about like what is the main key, what is the main problem we want to solve, what should be the main feature of our application. And then to have a look like, is this really supported with one of those frameworks? For example, if you say, okay, we want to have something which is really like, we have a use case which is really depends on the hardware and then some native libraries which might be not that broadly used, then maybe Flutter might not be the ideal solutions for you. But the same goes, for example, for React Native. If you have an Android, if you just want to develop an Android application, and that might also be not React Native the best case for you, because iOS elements are actually better supported than the ones from Android. So in that case might also be you say, okay, maybe even native development might be something we would like to consider. Although we might have like then to develop in two directions, but maybe just the features which are supported are like more or would suit our use case better. Because also like with, for example, there's also things like Swift UI, where also on the native part, like there's aspects, those declarative approaches React Native and Flutter follow, which are also applied there, which will then also enable features like the hot reload also in the native, on the native part. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed it. And I also look forward to your questions, and maybe if you'd like to share some experiences when you've worked with it before.
Thanks, Karina. If now is a great time, if you haven't, I'm going to hand over to you, Rufus. I wasn't sure, but I just wanted to remind everyone, please, if you have a question, write it in the chat and I'll hand over to you, Rufus. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenna. I feel so superfluous in this situation. I was going to say exactly the same. Thanks, Jenna. Thank you so much, Karina, for sharing. I hope you all enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to a great conversation. I'll mostly stay in the background and be quiet unless there's anything that needs to be moderated or anything. So I'll just open the floor for questions. Feel free to add them to the chat. Feel free to also come off mute and ask them directly.
Thank you, Rufus. Yes, we will not bite.
All right, maybe everyone is processing the information, weighing their decision between the two options. Okay, I see question coming in from Bruno. Do you want me to take that, Rufus, or would you like to read that? I can do, okay, great. Regarding the go-to-market dimension, which approach would actually allow a company to develop faster in the majority of times?
I think, as said, like it depends on a lot of on a lot of cases, but I think, like, for example, with React Native, also depends like on the knowledge you have in your team. Like, for example, if you have web developers and you just want to get started with mobile application development, then maybe React Native might be a good starting point for you, because the technology is really similar and can get you started there really fast. So also like Flutter has also different advantages, which then would be, for example, of course, maybe like Dart as a programming language might be not as well known as JavaScript, but it's also like with the background, I would say it's also, it's not like the learning curve is not too steep on that one as well. And you might also have, like, as I said, like you can also use it for web applications. So that might also be a point to consider. So I would say it's really hard to say this in general, but yeah, also like good to consider like which knowledge you have in your teams.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, we've got questions rolling in. So number 2, any real life examples of apps you know for both of the frameworks?
Oh God. Actually, I know that the Google Ads app is developed with Flutter, and I think there's like also some like just Google, I don't want to say anything wrong now, which might have changed or something. So I have some names in my head, but just also like for React Native, there are also like a lot of examples which have been developed with it. I just like have the really famous one, which is Airbnb in my head, but which stepped away from React Native. So
I think quite a lot of Facebook stuff is on React Native still.
Yeah, I think also what also not 100% of some of Instagram might also be, which belongs to Facebook, might also be using React Native.
Thanks. Great. Third question. What do you use at Thoughtworks? Flutter, React Native, or both?
That's also a good question. So I think also we have this technology radar, which is developed regularly, and there's also Flutter is also mentioned in there. So I think it also I thought it always depends at the use case, which is like the best for the client. So it's never like, okay, you should use this this framework. There's like a lot of aspects to consider, but there are also a lot of use cases where we're using React Native on Thoughtworks projects.
I can add to that briefly. Since we're a professional services company, that's a hard question to answer in an absolute sense, exactly like Karina said. So we do our best to stay ahead of trends and then sort of look at what options are. But as you can imagine, often our clients prefer to go with things that are more established. So we've done an awful lot of React Native over the last few years, and now we're getting to a point where folks are interested in Flutter, and so we're getting starting to get our feet wet with Flutter as well. So I don't think I can, at least not, I personally cannot give a fair comparison of the two.
Cool. Thanks to you both. All right. The fourth question is, do you have any recommendation for third-party React Native component library?
I don't have any like specific library, how do you say that, specific recommendation in mind, actually, because as well, like there's so many out there, especially like for React Native. It's really, really hard to pin that down. Yeah.
I think one thing to keep in mind is that any component library you choose will only get you to a certain point. I think if you go in with that expectation, you'll do well. There are a lot of really reputable ones out there. I mean, Material, of course, comes to mind. There are others. But I think one of the things to keep in mind is that as with anything, these things tend to only get you, let's say, I'm making this number up, let's say 80% of the way there. And then there's still, like, it'll never stop you from having to develop custom stuff.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, could you elaborate on the highly customizable UI for Flutter?
Yes, so in general, you have like a bit like, because for React Native, you use the native elements to display the user interface, which is like really, you have like when you have a button or when you're using like a text, this is like really the native thing of the platform, which would be then called like the native component. On Flutter, you don't have this. So you do have like, you have like those libraries, like also called like Material, for example, or Cupertino, which then more rely or like be closer to Android or iOS. But you're really free in like designing your user interface if you like to, if this is something that you want, and even like to make sure, okay, even if we have like different operating systems or different platforms, to make sure that it will look really similar or like the same, because it's like pixel based on Flutter.
Great, thank you.
I hope this answered the question.
Write us in the chat if you need more info. All right, so the next question is, I started with this topic a few weeks ago and have the feeling with React Vue or Vue native, you can get trapped in JS dependency hell. Flutter worked very much better for me. Does anyone feel the same way? I don't know if you two can speak to that or if that's just more a general shout out to the audience. So.
Yeah, so yeah, maybe if also like someone from the audience who has also worked with it would like to take that, but I can also say like when I've worked with both of them, I also enjoyed that with Flutter, because I had the feeling, because from the core library there are already a lot of elements, and it also like it seemed to fit like really well together, everything. So it was really easy to use like different widgets. So I had like the same feeling there, but might also as well like depend a lot on the use case you have.
All right, the next one is, do you think Flutter Web is production ready?
That's a good question, because I haven't actually yet worked with Flutter Web, and I also I looked a bit into it, but I cannot really say something to that one actually, because I haven't worked with it yet.
Thanks. The next one is regarding the distribution sizes and cold loading time. Do you have any numbers to share?
I don't have any specific numbers to share. No, unfortunately not.
Okay. The next one, did I get it right that Flutter primarily is better for Android and not in the same way as supporting iOS? So why should I use Flutter? I guess there are really limited cases just developing apps for only Android.
I think you can also use Flutter for iOS apps, but it then depends, of course, like what is it what you want to achieve and what is your use case and what is it what you need. So I think there was, especially in the beginning of Flutter, some cases like that some parts on iOS were not that well supported. I think that gets better over time because also like Flutter is like it's constantly evolving, and they're like adding also like, yeah, it's constantly evolving and changing. But yeah, like I'm not saying that you should use Flutter, but it just depends on your use case, and it might be that it is something for you, might also be that in that case, like for example, React Native would be a better approach then.
Thanks, Karina. Cool. The next question, how would you compare the learning curve for React Native /JS versus Flutter /Dart if you are a native or non-JS developer already?
I think like with Dart, it has the advantage that it is typed. So I think it's a bit more closer to like native development when you come like from Java side or when you come from Swift, for example. I personally felt that it has a bit more similarity there, but of course, like also for React Native, like with JavaScript, there are a lot of tutorials to get started on that one as well. So yeah.
I'll add one thing on this, which is that there's also the reverse case to consider. So I think if you're a mobile developer already, like a native developer of any description, you always have an advantage when it comes to mobile app development. So it's a fantastic base to do mobile development, obviously. I came at it from the other side, so I'm quite deep in JavaScript, and so I happened to do a mobile project that was React Native. And the other way around is I find much more dangerous, where again you can get like 80% of the way, by using just the framework. And then there's always things that you run into where third-party libraries don't work properly, or you ultimately do end up having to know the inner workings of mobile native, and you just really struggle if that's not something that you're competent with. So whether or not you end up going with Dart or you end up going with JS, I think you can already feel comfortable knowing that you understand the inner workings of mobile. That's a great base.
Great, thank you both. Next question is, how well does hot reload work for Flutter compared to React Native?
I think actually, like in my experience, it worked pretty well, and it's also like really fast. You have cases where you cannot use a hot reload, then you have to use like a hot restart. But this is also like working really fast, and it's speeds up actually the whole development workflow really well.
Thank you. This looks like our last question so far, at least. So unfortunately I came late. No worries. We recorded it. You can get the recording after. But did you also make a statement regarding Ionic Framework? If not, could you? Thanks so much, or thanks a lot.
I cannot really make a statement to that because I have never like worked with it. It's just like it follows a different approach than React Native or Flutter do. So it's more like using web views, which are integrated then like into a native container. So I would say it's not as close to the native platform as React Native or Flutter are, but I cannot really make a statement how good or bad it is because I've never worked with it myself.
For what it's worth, it's something that the whole web view focused sort of approach to mobile is something that Thoughtworks, I won't say we've abandoned, that's much too harsh, but it's something we do much less these days. So we prefer to work more with the frameworks and approaches that are closer to native.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, I don't know. It looks like you've answered several questions. We had a bunch coming in all at once, which has been great, but it looks like the question part is kind of winding up. I don't know if either of you have any kind of final thoughts or anything you'd like to share as we sort of wind down for the evening, Karina and Rufus.
No, thank you, Jenna. So like, yeah, if there's anything else, just feel free to also just unmute yourself if you like to ask something. But otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for joining and spending your sunny evenings, especially at least in Hamburg, it's sunny. So really rare in this summer. So thank you very much for spending this here and for attending.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.